not genetically determined. There are good reasons to suppose that group permeability is not genetically determined, and the evidence indicates that Jews have been exquisitely aware of this since the origins of Judaism as a group evolutionary strategy. At times, Jewish groups have endeavored to foster an illusion of group permeability in order to minimize anti-Semitism. Although Jews may well be genetically predisposed to form impermeable ethnic groups and resist genetic and cultural assimilation, there is little reason to suppose that this is genetically determined. Indeed, the evidence reviewed indicates the central importance of several cultural and environmental factors for the success of Judaism as a relatively impermeable group evolutionary strategy. Intensive socialization for a Jewish in-group identity and a group allegiance, the great variety of mechanisms of separations, which are clothes, language, hairstyles, etc., and the cultural invention of the hereditary priestly and Levitical classes. Moreover, the removal of intensely cultural separatism characteristic of Judaism in traditional societies has resulted in a long-term decline of dysphoria Judaism. As a result, in the contemporary Western world, Jewish groups often go to great lengths to discourage intermarriage and to develop greater Jewish consciousness and to commitment among Jews. This attempt to reestablish the cultural supports for Jewish identification and non-assimilation often involves the suggestion of a return to Jewish religious belief and ritual as the only way to stave off the long-term assimilative pressures of contemporary Western societies. This is the conclusion of Chapter 2. The Boasian School and Decline of Darwinism. Conclusion. Conclusion. A common thread of this chapter has been that scientific skepticism and what one might term, quote, scientific obscurantism, unquote, have been useful tools in combating scientific theories one dislikes for deeper reasons. Thus, the Boasian demand for the highest standards of proof for generalizations about culture and for establishing a role for genetic variation in the development of individual differences coincided with the acceptance of an, quote, anti-theory of culture that was fundamentally in opposition to attempts to develop classifications and generalizations in the field. Similarly, the dynamic contextualist theoretical perspective, though rejecting behavioral genetics and evolutionary theorizing about human development as failing to meet scientific standards of proof, has proposed a theory of development in which the relation between genes and environment is an extremely complex and ultimately unanalyzable fusion. Moreover, a major theme of Chapter 5 is that the radical skepticism of the Frankfurt School of Social Research was self-consciously directed at deconstructing universalist assimilatory theories of society as a homogeneous, harmonious whole. Scientific skepticism regarding politically sensitive issues has also been a powerful trend in the writings of S.J. Gould. Carl Degler says of Gould that, quote, an opponent of sociobiology like Gould does indeed emphasize that interaction, that is, between biology and environment, but at the same time he persistently resists investigations of the role of each of the interacting elements, unquote. Jensen states of Gould's work on intelligence testing, quote, I believe that he has succeeded brilliantly in obfuscating all the important open questions that actually concern today's scientists, unquote. This type of intellectual work is aimed at precluding the development of general theories of human behavior in which genetic variation plays an independently analyzable causative role in producing adaptive behavior. We have seen how R.C. Lewoten has linked theories of behavioral development with Marxist political ideology. As do Lerner and Gould, Lewoten advocates theories proposing that nature consists of extremely complex dialectic interactions between organism and environment. Lewoten rejects reductionist scientific methods such as quantitative behavioral genetics or the use of analysis of variance procedures because they inevitably oversimplify real processes in their use of averages. The result is a hyperism that settles for nothing less than absolute certainty, an absolutely correct methodology, epistemology, and ontology. In developmental psychology, such a program would ultimately lead to rejection of all generalizations, including those relating to the average effects of environment. Because each individual has a unique set of genes and is constantly developing in a unique and constantly changing environment, God himself would probably have difficulty providing a deterministic account of individual development, and in any case, such an account must necessarily, like a Boasian theory of culture, be deferred long into the future. By adopting this philosophy of science, Lewoten is able to discredit attempts by scientists to develop theories and generalizations, and thus, in the name of scientific rigor, avoid the possibility of any politically unacceptable scientific findings. Siegerstall notes that while using this theory as a weapon against biological views in the social sciences, Lewoten's own empirical research in population biology has remained firmly within the reductionist tradition. Gould and Lewoten's critique of adaptism may also be viewed as an exemplar of the skeptical thrust of Jewish intellectual activity. Acknowledging the existence of adaptations, the argument effectively problematizes the status of any putative adaptation. Gould then goes from the possibility that any putative adaptation may simply be a, quote, spandrel that, like the architectural form from which its name derives, results from structural constraints imposed by true adaptations, to the remarkable suggestion that the human mind be viewed as a collection of such non-functional spandrels. As noted above, Gould's larger agenda is to convince his audience that the human brain has not evolved to solve adaptive problems, a view anthropologist Vincent Saric has termed behavioral creationism. Indeed, fascination with the slippery rhetoric of the Gould and Lewoten spandrels article has resulted in an entire volume of essays dedicated to dissecting the writing style of this essay. Scientific skepticism is a powerful approach, since a very basic feature of science is an openness to criticism and a requirement that arguments be supported with evidence. As E.O. Wilson notes, quote, by adopting a narrow criterion of publishable research, Lewoten freed himself to pursue a political agenda unencumbered by science. He adopted the relativist view that accepted truth, unless based on inelucidable fact, is no more than a reflection of dominant ideology and political power, unquote. Similar themes with similar motivations characterize the ideologies of the Frankfurt School and postmodernism discussed in Chapter 5. Nevertheless, Lewoten portrays his ideological inspired efforts as deriving from a concern for scientific rigor. Quote, this is Lewoten. We demand certain canons of evidence and arguments that are formal and without reference to empirical content, the logic of statistical inference, the power of replicating experiments, the distinction between observations and casual claims, unquote. The result is a thoroughgoing skepticism. For example, all theories of the origins of the sexual division of labor are said to be, quote, speculative, unquote. Similarly, Gould rejects all accounts of the empirical data in the area of intelligence testing, but provides no alternatives. As Jensen notes, quote, Gould offers no alternative ideas to account for all of these well-established observations. His mission in this area appears entirely nihilistic, unquote. Similarly, Buzz notes that whereas the adaptationist perspective in psychology has resulted in a rich body of theoretical predictions and in numerous confirmatory empirical studies, Gould's ideas of spandrels and excipitations, that's a term variously used by Gould, but perhaps most often referring to mechanisms that have new biological functions that are not the ones that caused the original selection of the mechanism, has resulted in no theoretical predictions and no empirical research. Again, the mission seems to be what one might term nihilistic anti-science. As with Boas, Lee Wotton holds biologically oriented research on humans to an extremely rigorous standard, but is remarkably lenient in the standards required to prove biology has very little influence. Lee Wotton claims, for example, that, quote, nearly all the biology of gender is bad science, unquote. But on the following page, he states as an obvious truth that, quote, the human being is the nexus of a larger number of weakly acting causes, unquote. And Lee Wotton states without argument or reference that, quote, no one has ever found a correlation between cognitive ability and brain size, unquote. At this writing, there have been at least 26 published studies on 39 independent samples showing a correlation of approximately 0.20 between head circumference and IQ. There have also been at least 6 published studies showing a correlation of approximately 0.40 between brain size and IQ using the more accurate technique of MRI to directly scan the brain. Given this body of findings, it is at least misleading to make such a statement, although Lee Wotton would presumably argue that none of these studies reach acceptable levels of scientific proof. Franz Boas would be proud. That's the end of Chapter 2, the Boasian School of Anthropology and the Decline of Darwinism in the Social Sciences. As MacDonald makes clear with Lee Wotton, and, in the very last part here, Lee Wotton and brain size, skull size and IQ, there are correlations. That's why blacks have a different IQ, because their skull is different, and that's why the IQ is. There's, as he says here, at least 6 published studies with the newest MRI, and 26 published and 39 independent samples with 0.20 between head circumference and IQ. So what the Boas school did was basically you had guys like Lee Wotton who would just be like, who cares? Who cares if there's 26 studies? It's anti-Semitic and it's not real. Folks, thanks for listening, and check out more of our content on jettandjahn.com.